Allen Bloom, a University of Chicago philosophy professor, published The Closing of the American Mind in 1987, and to his astonishment, it became a national bestseller. A prolonged howl of anguish against the decline of civilization. It was particularly harsh in its condemnation of youth culture, rock music, hedonism, and overindulgent parenting. Bloom sought the wisdom of the ancients and appealed against trendy and relevant approaches to education. At the same time, E.D. Hirsch published Cultural Literacy, deploring the decline of a nationally shared fund of knowledge. On behalf of rigour in the arts and scholarship, Hilton Kramer founded New Criterion in 1982. He too hated the substitution of political relevance for aesthetic excellence in literature and painting. These cultural protests from conservatives who took on the role of their generation's guardians of civilization came to a head in a controversy over the writing of national standards for the study of history. Lynn Cheney, head of the National Endowment for the Humanities, led the charge against what she saw as the biased Hate America curriculum produced by Gary Nash and his team at the University of California, Los Angeles. It gave more attention to Harriet Tubman than to George Washington, frequently referred to the Ku Klux Klan and the Trail of Tears, while passing over Edison and Carnegie in silence. And it put Rockefeller on trial for economic crimes. Roger Kimball suggested in Tenured Radicals that the New Left, defeated on the streets in the 1960s, had now taken over the academy and was subverting the minds of impressionable youth with leftist propaganda. Collectively, these culture warriors argued that conservatives had won the battle for national politics, but lost the battle for the souls of young Americans. Well, American conservatives in the 80s and 90s became increasingly afraid that, despite their political successes, it was all going to turn to ashes if they weren't able to hold on to the high ground of American culture and civilization, and particularly education. This was the importance to them of Allen Bloom's book, The Closing of the American Mind. And Bloom described the United States as a wilderness of rock music, pornography, ignorance, self-indulgence, and hedonism. Here's one of the most famous passages from the book on the degradation of young people today. He wrote, "Picture a 13-year-old boy sitting in the living room of his family home doing his math assignment while wearing his Walkman headphones or watching MTV. He enjoys the liberties hard won over the centuries by the alliance of philosophic genius and political heroism, consecrated by the blood of martyrs. He is provided with comfort and leisure by the most productive economy ever known to mankind. Science has penetrated the secrets of nature in order to provide him with the marvelous, lifelike electronic sound and imagery production he is enjoying. And in what does progress culminate? A pubescent child whose body throbs with orgasmic rhythms, whose feelings are made articulate in hymns to the joy of onanism or the killing of parents, whose ambition is to win fame and wealth, imitating the drag queen who makes the music. In short, life is made into a non-stop, commercially pre-packaged masturbational fantasy. People of future civilizations will wonder at this and find it as incomprehensible as we do the caste system, witch-burning, harems, cannibalism, and gladiatorial combats." Well, Allen Bloom's recommendations about how to rescue America from this situation included a return to classical wisdom and a much more rigorous elitist education. He'd been a student of Leo Strauss, whose influence on the American conservative movement has been much debated. Strauss and Bloom, the student, were both great believers in the power of the very best literature to teach every generation. They had a small list of timeless classics. Plato, the authors of the Bible, Shakespeare, and Hegel were among them. And their view was that you shouldn't read these works in historical context, but rather you should read them as a source of absolutely dependable truth. They were very much against the idea of cultural relativism, which was becoming more and more persuasive in most parts of the American academy. To Alan Bloom's surprise, the book became a bestseller, and in fact it occasioned a great soul-searching throughout the nation, which ironically disproved the theme of the book. If the American mind was closed, books like that, full of dense philosophical passages, wouldn't get read at all. The very fact that so many people took the message so seriously and began to worry and to wonder and to hold concerned discussions about it could be taken as reassuring evidence that the American mind was very much alive and that the relationship between intellectual and moral things was an issue of active concern among important people. Academic reviewers rejected Bloom's assertions, while accusing him of sexism, racism, elitism, and opposition to multiculturalism and pluralism, which were some of the leading intellectual trends of the time. And he certainly was an elitist. He was quite open about that. When he was invited to give the graduation speech at Harvard University a year or two later, his speech began like this: "My fellow elitists." And his faith in absolute truth did make him ready to oppose multiculturalism. Cultural relativism itself has an interesting history. It had developed first of all in anthropology, as anthropologists had realised that rather than regarding their own society as right and that those they were going to study as more or less wrong, what they needed to do was to suspend their own values completely and try to understand the values of the societies into which they went on their own terms, to see how they functioned, how they made sense in terms of the cosmology of these different peoples. And gradually, the idea that academic study ought to be undertaken this way, with a cultural modesty, became more and more widespread. But conservative writers like Bloom said that liberals had taken it much too far, and that it prevented them from necessary discernment of what was good and what was bad. William Buckley had made that joke earlier. A liberal is someone who doubts his principles even while he's acting upon them. And although that was an intentional overstatement, it did embody a little kernel of truth, that confidence about one's values was becoming a little bit more, was much more hesitant by the late 20th century than it had been previously. More democratic in outlook, but equally dismayed by trends in American education, was E.D. Hirsch, with his program of cultural literacy, put forward in a book of the same name, Cultural Literacy, in 1987. Hirsch was a professor of English at the University of Virginia, and the theme of his book was this: educated Americans once shared a common body of knowledge that enabled them all to communicate accurately and efficiently. But trendy new curriculums, plus sheer neglect, had robbed many people of that common heritage, especially the poor and members of minority groups, so that they didn't know a wide range of cultural references, without which they worked at a terrible disadvantage in trying to get good jobs. They should learn this heritage anew in order to thrive in the wider world. The book Cultural Literacy ended with a 65-page list of basic ideas and concepts which everyone should know. And when you read the list, it all seems terribly disembodied and disjointed. Look under F in the list, for example, and you find this: fiscal policy, fish or cut bait, fission, nuclear, fits and starts, Fitzgerald, Ella, Fitzgerald, F. Scott, fjord, flapper, and so on. Later on, Hirsch followed up by writing the Dictionary of Cultural Literacy, in which he gave much more space to saying, this is what everybody needs to know. Now, like Alan Bloom, Hirsch was sharply criticised for privileging certain themes and ideas, and for seeing merit in learning by rote from lists, for neglecting a variety of learning styles, and for discriminating against minorities. He indignantly denied it and said he represented a real liberalism as opposed to one that had been seduced by relativism. I think it's justifiable to see him as a conservative, even though he wasn't sure it was a label he wanted, because of his central idea, which was that there's a common fund of ideas and a wisdom inherited from the past that everybody should know and build on as they preserve their civilization. Conservative literary and art critics feared that the quest for political correctness and contemporary relevance had trumped time-honoured artistic criteria. That was the motive of Hilton Kramer for the founding of another journal, The New Criterion, in 1982. He made an extremely sophisticated case for high standards and for a transcendence of politics in the arts. Hilton Kramer was the long-time chief art critic of the New York Times. But he believed that there are absolute standards in the arts and that they should be protected from criteria of political relevance. During the 1970s, 60s and 70s and into the 80s, the art world more and more was enthusiastic about art by women, art by minorities, art by refugees, art which either explicitly or with thin veiling made a political point rather than solely an aesthetic one. In Kramer's view, work like that may be good, but it ought not to be praised and it ought not to be given museum space unless it's good as art. In other words, unless it can fulfill the criteria of aesthetics as well as politics. Kramer was an enthusiast for abstract expressionism, the work of artists like Mark Rothko and Jackson Pollock. Earlier conservatives had hated work like that. In the early days of the National Review, you could sometimes find peppery critics saying that abstract art was itself part of the communist conspiracy. Well, that wasn't at all Hilton Kramer's way. But he did favour the idea of agreeing upon and maintaining high artistic considerations. Here's the first editorial from his journal in 1982, and he said that he was hearkening back to the day when criticism was more strictly concerned to distinguish achievement from failure, to identify and uphold a standard of quality, and to speak plainly and vigorously about the problems that beset the life of the arts and the life of the mind in our society. He added that the prevailing aesthetic and artistic ideas of the 1960s had been an insidious assault on the mind, substituting sentimental radicalism for intelligent and critical thought. What was even worse in his view was that the art world had turned against capitalism, even though in his opinion capitalism, for all its many flaws, has proved to be the greatest safeguard of democratic institutions and artistic freedom that the world has given us. In his view, it was insanity for artists not to favour capitalism because without it they couldn't prosper. Well, he tried hard to make sure that the pages of the New Criterion were non-partisan. But in fact, contributors to the journal as the 80s went on were increasingly recognisable conservatives. And they included names which will have become familiar to anyone who's listened to these lectures. People like Norman Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary, Gertrude Himmelfarb, Roger Scruton, the English conservative philosopher, and others like them. Conservative intellectuals also deplored the use of federal funds to underwrite art shows that many citizens regarded as blasphemous or pornographic. A flashpoint in this respect comes with the Corcoran Gallery's decision in 1989 to mount a display of photographs by Robert Mapplethorpe. Mapplethorpe himself, one of the famous photographers of the 80s, had recently died from AIDS. And the photos themselves expressed a very explicit homoeroticism, plus sadomasochistic themes. Jesse Helms and some other conservative politicians protested against the idea that federal funding should underwrite a show of this kind when the work itself clearly outraged the sensibilities of many viewers. Under this kind of political pressure, the gallery withdrew its sponsorship of the show. That led liberal intellectuals to cry censorship. But Hilton Kramer, writing in the New Criterion, said, no, this isn't censorship. Censorship would be preventing showing the work altogether, whereas in fact other galleries were going to pick it up. Here the issue is simply not using taxpayers' money, but permitting the show to go on elsewhere. Kramer also criticised the idea, which seemed to him to be becoming more and more widespread, that somehow the more shocking a piece of art was, somehow the better that made it, or the more relevant that made it. In his view, that was a fallacy. National Review wrote an editorial about this dispute and agreed that the photographer had chosen shocking subjects deliberately to affront the viewer's sense of decency. The editorialist went on. He, Mapplethorpe, exploited the dual reaction to create tension in the viewer. What is indecent and immoral becomes stunningly beautiful. There was no question, he said, that these were in fact phenomenally beautiful objects. But he added that it was disingenuous of liberals to imply that somehow they weren't shocking, or that somehow the dirty-mindedness of Jesse Helms was the real issue at stake. It wasn't. One of Hilton Kramer's friends was Roger Kimball. Roger Kimball deplored the politicisation not so much of art as of academic life, and wrote a book-length study of this phenomenon in a book called Tenured Radicals in 1990, and followed it up with another one called The Long March in the year 2000. He theorised that the new left radicals of the 1960s, having lost the battle in the streets in their revolutionary hopes of the Vietnam years, had now taken it to the college classroom instead. In other words, that they'd worked their way into academic institutions, they'd become faculty members, they'd got tenure, and now they were teaching sinister, alien leftist values to credulous generations of students. In a way, Tenured Radicals, this book by Kimball, was an update of William Buckley's book God and Man at Yale, written in the early 1950s, although he wasn't particularly interested in the religious side of the question. Kimball's point was this: parents, when they pay their children's college tuition, are paying to have their own values reinforced, but the professors undermine those values with subversive notions. The curriculum now, he said, includes gay studies, Afrocentrism, deconstructionism, all of which are assaults on the central principles of Western civilization. And when they're challenged on this point, he added, they shelter behind the idea of academic freedom and deny that anybody's got the right to specify what they must or must not teach. But actually, said Kimball, they're denying true academic freedom to professors and students who are conservatives, with a mixture of censorship and ridicule. So in other words, not only are they infecting young minds, they're also intolerant. His second book, The Long March, was a lament about the long shadow cast by the counterculture heroes of the 1960s. And in Kimball's view, these were a dreadful group: the Beatles, Abbie Hoffman, Allen Ginsberg. He said, between them, these culture heroes of the 60s had challenged the fundamentals of American sexual morality. They had degraded intellectual standards, and they'd promoted the cult of youth. He was alarmed to notice the way that even the defenders of civilization had picked up certain elements of their ideas, particularly the glorification of youth and the idea that excessive permissiveness should be encouraged rather than prevented. Well, it was common by the 1980s and 90s for liberal historians to denigrate the 1950s as the era of the man in the grey flannel suit, and by contrast to glorify the 60s as a period of great cultural and artistic outpouring. Roger Kimball did exactly the opposite. He was full of praise for the 50s, for its creativity, along with its stability, and the constructive aspects of the 1950s intellectual life, much of which was a great achievement that was then lost, he said, in the 60s. Reading Kimball side by side with some of the leftist historians is to get a kind of mirror image effect, praising either the 50s or the 60s, depending on which values you preferred. Kimball was a friend of Kramer's, and he also wrote regularly for the New Criterion. Here's a characteristic article by him. He said, much of what presents itself as art today can scarcely be distinguished from political sermonizing on the one hand, or the pathetic recapitulation of Dadaist pathologies on the other. He said that the New Criterion stood for the revival of basic artistic technique, basic excellence, which was itself increasingly being neglected, and that it was dedicated to ignoring shallow provocation. And, moreover, it was eager to recover the reputation of artists who'd wrongly been neglected because of the unfashionable themes of their work. He ended like this: the New Criterion has specialised in resuscitating important figures whose voices have been drowned out by the demotic inanities of pop culture or embalmed by the dead hand of the academy. A lovely kick at the academics there. On the one hand, he's saying that they're very sinister. On the other hand, that they kill everything they touch. Well, numerous conservative imitators also deplored the degradation of academic standards, the politicisation of higher education, and what they saw as academics' greed and empire-building tendencies. As you can tell from many of the people I'm discussing today, American academia was held very much under suspicion and in doubt by many American conservatives. Charles Sykes wrote a pair of books in the late 80s, one's called Prof Scam from 1988, the other's called The Hollow Men from 1990. And he argued that professors now use the tenure system not to advance daring new ideas, which was the justification for the system in the first place, but rather to shelter the fact that they were really very idle and that they were more interested in an incestuous form of academic inbreeding. Peter Shaw, in his book The War Against the Intellect from 1989, deplored the rise of victim groups as objects of study. He said, there's been a steady decline of rigorous intellectual standards, and they've been replaced by emotion and wish fulfillment, especially in new disciplines like women's studies and the studies of third world peoples, which, in his view, competed with one another to find people who could be described as victims and then sympathised with and given special consideration, while assaulting the dead white males who allegedly had persecuted them. This was a major theme of conservative writing throughout the 1980s and 90s and to some extent into the new century. Now, at the same time that a wide array of conservative adults were writing in this way, conservative students were also becoming involved in writing critical work of their own. Conservative student journals, such as the Dartmouth Review, which was founded in 1980, also began to complain against political correctness and fashionable ideologies on campus. The first of these student journals had been The Alternative, founded at the University of Indiana back in the late 1960s by Emmett Tyrrell. And Tyrrell had made the exceptional jump from starting out as the editor of a student paper and then managing to grow up with his paper and launch it on the nationwide scale as The American Spectator, which was one of the most successful conservative journals of the 70s and 80s. One of the founders of the Dartmouth Review was Benjamin Hart, the son of Geoffrey Hart, who was a senior editor at National Review and a close friend of William Buckley. In other words, Ben Hart, in starting his journal, has a lot of expert opinion to draw on, very, very close to home indeed. With his father's help, he managed to raise funds from conservative foundations, pointing out to them that these battles for ideas start on campuses. And if the campuses are in fact in the hands of the radicals and the liberals, we students need to fight back. We need to offer an alternative vision of the truth to students who otherwise aren't going to hear conservative points at all. Many of the conservative foundations found that idea persuasive and began to give money to conservative student papers. The Dartmouth Review from the outset was very hostile to affirmative action, both in student selection and in faculty appointments. They ridiculed radical professors, particularly those who favoured ideas of political correctness. And they were particularly harsh against a music professor, an African-American, who sometimes delivered abusive racial harangues in class, finally forcing him into retirement. One college official was so vexed by the Dartmouth Review and its provocation that in a confrontation with Benjamin Hart, he actually bit the young editor. Ben Hart wrote a memoir about all this called Poisoned Ivy, obviously punning on the idea on the one hand of poison ivy and the other idea of the Ivy League schools. One of his fellow editors was Dinesh D'Souza, who, like Emmett Tyrrell, went on from student journalism to becoming a significant figure in the conservative movement later on in his life. And D'Souza, thinking about the work of the Dartmouth Review, described later the paradoxical situation in which they'd found themselves as young student journalists. D'Souza wrote this: "The dilemma can be stated this way. Typically, the conservative attempts to conserve, to hold on to the values of the existing society. But what if the existing society is inherently hostile to conservative beliefs? It is foolish for a conservative to attempt to conserve that culture. Rather, he must seek to undermine it, to thwart it, to destroy it at the root level. This means that the conservative must be philosophically conservative, but temperamentally radical. That is what we at the Dartmouth Review quickly understood." And certainly that was true of D'Souza himself, who remained a lightning rod for controversy into his adult life. Another of their editors in the early years, who went on to an adult career in conservative journalism, was Laura Ingraham. And the Dartmouth Review wasn't the only one. Similar journals, also with foundation funding, began to spring up on other campuses. The Cornell Review was one, and Ann Coulter began her career as a polemical conservative writer there. The alumni of all these journals emphasised the importance of them as a place where they could meet other young conservatives and share ideas in an academic environment that was otherwise perceived to be hostile. A controversy over whether the United States should have national standards for the study of history and what they should consist of exposed the gulf between conservative and liberal ideas about the American past. Lynn Cheney, who was the head of the National Endowment for the Humanities in the first Bush administration, she was the wife of the man who later became the second Bush's vice president, commissioned the standards. And Gary Nash, a professor at the University of California, Los Angeles, headed the team that wrote them. Now, by the time the draft of the National History Standards was finished, Cheney was already out of office. It was 1994 by then. But when she read the draft of what they'd come up with, she thought of it as little better than anti-American propaganda. And Congress rejected them out of hand, compelling the team to modify them. Cheney said they were unpatriotic, politically correct, and hardly better than propaganda against the nation. She noted in an op-ed piece that they included 6 favourable references to Harriet Tubman, 19 negative references to McCarthyism, no reference to the Constitutional Convention, or to the Wright brothers, or to Einstein, or to Thomas Alva Edison, the great inventor. Rockefeller was depicted as a robber baron. The standards even proposed that he should be put on trial for his unethical business practices, which of course implied his guilt even before the trial began. And many conservative journalists reading them agreed with Lynn Cheney's estimate. Charles Krauthammer, who was an influential writer in those decades, agreed, quote, "The whole document strains to promote the achievements and highlight the victimization of the country's preferred minorities, while straining equally to degrade the achievements and highlight the flaws of the white males who ran the country for its first 2 centuries. A second draft was produced 2 years later in 1996, more nuanced, less confrontationally politically correct. But it still refused to give conservatives the kind of celebratory curriculum they had anticipated and hoped for. Lynn Cheney still didn't like these new standards, and she realised that she might have made a mistake. Perhaps she'd made the situation worse by creating a nationwide curriculum that would now be bad for everyone. At least if it was left at the state level, many children would be spared the national travesty. Lynn Cheney wrote a book about the whole controversy called Telling the Truth, and it depicts her as the guardian of threatened truth and common sense. Incidentally, paleo-conservatives would have said to her right up front, of course you shouldn't have national standards. If you let every community decide for itself, you'll have a healthy diversity of opinions rather than one tyrannical centralised version, which is bad enough anyway on principle, and even worse if it's all political correctness. Meanwhile, on the other side of the controversy, Gary Nash himself wrote a memoir of the whole experience, a book called History on Trial, published in the year 2000. In a tone of wounded innocence, he justified the standards and said it was necessary to include the voices of previously silenced or neglected Americans. In Nash's view, surely a democracy should take the view that all its people were worthy of having their stories told, not just the elites. In his view, the Conservatives had a very, very narrow view of what history was. Well, whether history is supposed to teach moral lessons, and if so, which ones, remained open to question. And I think that's a good transition point for me to begin tying up this whole lecture series, where I'll also ask the question of, does history teach us moral lessons?